You don't know me, Marcellus. But if you walk through those double doors in 10 minutes, your wife's therapist is going to make sure you never see your daughter unsupervised again. He's done this to 3 other fathers in this building over the last 18 months. Always the same script.
I build parks. I keep the city standing. And now I'm the one described as a structural hazard?
You don't know me, Marcellus, but if you walk through those double doors in 10 minutes, your wife's therapist is going to make sure you never see your daughter unsupervised again. The words cut through the clinical chill of the Harris County Family Court waiting room like a physical blow. I froze, my thumb resting on the edge of a thick manila folder containing the worst allegations ever written about me. I looked up. The woman sitting 2 plastic chairs away from me didn't look like an enemy. She was in her late 30s, wearing a sharp charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back into a neat, professional bun. Her eyes were fixed on me, steady and dead serious, showing none of the chaotic anxiety that filled the rest of the room. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice sounding raspy. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours a night since Alicia had handed me the divorce papers. "Who are you?" "My name is Desiree Holt," she said, leaning slightly closer so her voice wouldn't carry over the hum of the air conditioning. "I'm a family court mediator here. I have nothing to do with your case file officially, which means I shouldn't be talking to you. But I saw your name on the docket this morning. Marcellus Renwick. And then I saw the name of the expert witness your wife's attorney is introducing, Dr. Xavier Combs." My heart hammered against my ribs. "How do you know Xavier?" "Because I've seen him destroy 3 other men in this exact building over the last 18 months, Desiree said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "He uses the exact same strategy every single time. He finds a wife who feels lonely or disconnected, convinces her that her husband's quiet nature is actually a form of deep-seated, dangerous emotional instability, and writes an evaluation that makes the father look like a ticking psychological time bomb. If you let them present that file today without a fight, the judge will restrict your access to your daughter before lunchtime." I looked down at the paper in my lap. The petition for divorce, filed by Alicia Faulkner Renwick, was 42 pages of clinical assassination. It accused me of emotional withholding, unpredictable behavioral swings, and psychological volatility. The most damning document was a preliminary mental health evaluation signed by Dr. Xavier Combs, a man I had never met, but who apparently knew everything about my damaged psyche. I was 44 years old and had spent 16 years as a senior urban planner for the city of Houston. My entire career was built on the concepts of structure, safety, and long-term stability. I designed drainage networks for areas like the Third Ward, calculated traffic capacities, and ensured the city's foundations held when heavy storms hit. I was the guy who kept things standing. Yet, here I was, described as a structural hazard to my own family. "This is crazy," I muttered, shaking my head. "Alicia knows I'm not unstable. We've been married for 10 years. We have an 8-year-old daughter, Nova. She is my entire world. I've never raised my voice to either of them. I don't drink, I don't gamble. I build parks." "It doesn't matter what the truth is, Marcellus," Desiree said, her eyes locked onto mine. "In this building, the truth is whatever paper trail is loudest. And right now, your wife has a certified family therapist claiming you are unfit. Do you know what Xavier Combs' track record is? Out of the 3 cases I watched him handle, 2 of the fathers lost joint custody entirely. They only get supervised visits on alternating weekends. The 3rd man had to sell his house just to pay for the court-ordered psychological monitoring." The room seemed to tilt. The thought of not being able to put Nova to bed, of not hearing her laugh as we worked on her school science projects, or of having some court-appointed stranger sitting in the corner of the room while I played board games with my own daughter, made me feel physically sick. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, suddenly suspicious. If you're a mediator, aren't you supposed to be neutral? Why risk your job to warn a stranger? Desiree looked toward the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302, where my wife and her high-priced attorney were currently preparing their strategy. Because I hate seeing a system meant to protect children being used as a weapon to tear them away from good fathers. Xavier Combs isn't a healer, Marcellus. He's a mercenary. He charges $15,000 for these evaluations, and he knows exactly what his clients want to buy. In your case, it's not just your wife who's buying. It's her mother, isn't it? Delphine Faulkner? The mention of my mother-in-law's name made my stomach tighten. Delphine Faulkner was a retired Houston City Councilwoman. She was a woman who had spent 30 years navigating the backrooms of local politics, a master of leverage and public image. She had never liked me. To Delphine, a senior urban planner was just a middle-class bureaucrat with a pension, not nearly prestigious enough for her only daughter. Yes, I admitted. Delphine is funding the attorneys. She's funding the therapist too, Desiree said. I looked at the financial disclosures filed in your preliminary paperwork. The checks to Dr. Combs's clinic didn't come from your joint household account. They came from a private LLC registered under Delphine's home address. Alicia probably doesn't even know the full amount her mother is paying him. I leaned back against the hard plastic chair, my mind racing through the last 12 months. It felt like watching a slow-motion demolition of a building I had spent a decade constructing. The cracks hadn't appeared overnight. They had been engineered, inch by inch, by people I had let into my home. 10 years ago, Alicia and I had met at a community feedback meeting for a park revitalization project in the 3rd Ward. She was a young, passionate interior designer representing a local neighborhood coalition. She wanted more community art spaces. I was the municipal engineer trying to explain why we had to prioritize flood mitigation basins first. We argued for 2 hours in front of 50 residents, but afterward, over coffee at a diner on Westheimer Road, we realized we wanted the same thing, to build something beautiful that would last. When we got married, Alicia told me she loved my calmness. She said her childhood had been a loud, chaotic circus of political dinners, public scandals, and her mother's volatile temper. She called me her anchor. But over the last year, that anchor had been recharacterized. Under the guidance of Dr. Combs, my quietness was no longer a sign of stability. It was stonewalling. My patience was passive-aggressive control. My dedication to my work was intentional neglect. Marcellus Renwick? A bailiff stood at the doorway of courtroom 302, holding a clipboard and looking out over the waiting area. Desiree stood up quickly, smoothing her blazer. That's your cue. Do not agree to any temporary custody arrangements today. No matter how much pressure your lawyer or the judge puts on you, demand an independent, court-appointed psychological evaluation. It will buy you time, and it will force Combs to put his methodology on the record. That's his weak point. Wait, I said, rising to my feet. How do I prove he's doing this on purpose? I'm working on that, Desiree whispered, taking a step back into the crowd of lawyers and litigants. Just survive today. Don't let them see you sweat. If you react, if you get angry, you prove his report right. I watched her disappear into the elevator bank, leaving me alone with the heavy manila folder in my hand. I took a deep breath, adjusted my tie, and walked toward the courtroom door. Inside, my wife of 10 years was waiting to tell a judge that I was a danger to the person I loved most in the world. I walked through the double doors of courtroom 302, my boots making a dull, heavy sound on the polished linoleum. In my line of work, you learn to read the structural integrity of a building just by walking its halls. You look for the hairline fractures in the concrete pillars, the slight sagging in the door frames, the water stains on the ceiling that hint at a failing roof drainage system. If you ignore those quiet, subtle signs of stress, the entire structure eventually comes down, and it always happens faster than you think. I had spent 16 years applying that exact philosophy to the city of Houston. As a senior urban planner, my job wasn't to design the flashy skyscrapers. My job was the invisible work. I calculated flood runoff capacities for the bayous, designed the underground retention basins in the 3rd Ward, and made sure that when a tropical storm dumped 20 inches of rain, the streets didn't turn into rivers and swallow people's homes. I believed in foundations. I believed that a city, just like a marriage, is kept safe not by what you see on the surface, but by the strength of the infrastructure buried deep underground. I had brought that same belief into my marriage with Alicia. When things got tense, when her design business struggled to meet its quarterly goals, or when her mother, Delphine, became too overbearing, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell or make demands. I did what I always did. I absorbed the load. I worked longer hours to cover our mortgage, quietly handled the household chores, and gave Alicia the space she needed to breathe. I thought my silence was a shield. I thought my calm, unshakable presence was the bedrock of our family. But as I took my seat at the defense table next to my attorney, Marcus Vance, and looked across the aisle at Alicia, I realized that my bedrock had been redefined as quicksand. Alicia sat next to her attorney, a cutthroat family lawyer named Cynthia Sterling, whom Delphine had undoubtedly hired. Alicia didn't look at me. She was 40, but today she looked younger and more fragile. Dressed in a soft, cream-colored knit sweater, her hands were folded neatly on top of a legal notepad. Next to her, sitting in the first row of the gallery, was Delphine Faulkner. Even at 66, my mother-in-law carried herself with the sharp, military posture of a retired city councilwoman. She wore a tailored navy blue suit, her signature gold brooch pinned to her lapel, and her eyes were fixed on the back of my head like laser sights. My attorney, Marcus, leaned over and whispered, "They're going to push hard for a temporary custody order today, Marcellus. They want to limit you to supervised visits at a commercial facility. They're claiming your emotional state is too erratic for Nova to be left alone with you." "That's a lie, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low and steady, remembering Desiree's warning in the hallway. "I've never been erratic in my life. You've seen my performance reviews at the city. I am the most stable person in this room." "I know that," Marcus said, "but they have a clinical evaluation from Dr. Xavier Combs. In the eyes of the court, a licensed family therapist's word carries more weight than your city HR files. We have to play this." Incredibly smart. I looked back at Alicia, trying to find a trace of the woman I had fallen in love with 10 years ago. We had met in the summer of 2016 at a heated community feedback meeting in the 3rd Ward. The city was planning to renovate a historical neighborhood park, and I was the lead municipal engineer. Alicia was representing a local residents' coalition, terrified that the city's plan would strip the park of its cultural soul. She had stood up in front of a crowd of 80 people and pointed a finger directly at my slides. "You're building a drainage basin, mister. Renwick, not a community space," she had said, her voice shaking with passion. "Our children don't need a concrete bowl. They need grass. They need art. They need a place where they can feel safe." Instead of getting defensive, I had waited for the crowd to quiet down, walked up to the easel, and redrew the drainage layout right there on the whiteboard. I showed her how we could disguise the retention basin as a sunken amphitheater with local brickwork, preserving the historic oak trees she loved so much. I didn't raise my voice. I just showed her the math and the design, proving that we could have both safety and beauty. After the meeting, she had approached me, looking slightly embarrassed. "I'm sorry for yelling," she had said, offering me a paper cup of coffee. "I'm just used to people in City Hall ignoring us." "I don't ignore people, Alicia," I had told her. "I just like to make sure the foundation is solid before we start painting the walls." She had smiled then, a genuine, warm smile. Over the next year, as we dated and married, she told me repeatedly that my calm nature was the only thing that kept her sane. Her childhood home, dominated by Delphine's political ambition and explosive temper, had been a minefield. Her father had fled when she was 7, unable to handle the constant, loud warfare. Alicia had grown up walking on eggshells, never knowing what would trigger her mother's next screaming fit. "With you, I can finally breathe," she had whispered to me on our wedding night. "You don't explode, Marcellus. You don't play games. You're just there, like a mountain." But mountains are cold, and eventually, if you stand in their shadow long enough without understanding them, they can begin to feel oppressive. The shift had started about a year ago, right around the time Nova turned 7. My mother, who had been my own anchor after my father passed away, suffered a massive stroke. The damage was severe. She lost her ability to speak and her right side was completely paralyzed. The doctors told me she needed 24-hour care in a specialized facility, a cost that our basic insurance didn't even begin to cover. I didn't want to burden Alicia. Her interior design firm was struggling after losing a major commercial contract, and she was already stressed to the point of tears most nights. I made a decision. I didn't tell her that I had cleared out my personal retirement account, the one I had built up over 15 years of city service, to pay the initial 6-month deposit for my mother's care facility. When she asked how we were affording it, I lied. I told her that my mother's old union insurance policy was covering 90% of the costs. I did it to protect her. I did it so she wouldn't have to choose between her business and my mother's dignity. But to do it, I had to carry a mountain of financial stress on my own shoulders. I started working overtime, taking on extra consulting projects, and spending my lunch breaks filing paperwork. I became quieter. When I came home, I was exhausted. I would sit on the couch, staring at the wall, trying to figure out how I was going to pay the next month's bill without defaulting on our mortgage. And that was when Dr. Xavier Combs entered our lives. Dr. Xavier Combs did not look like a predator. He looked like an advertisement for a high-end wellness retreat. He was 47 years old, with perfectly trimmed graying hair, wore cashmere sweaters under unstructured linen blazers, and spoke in a low, measured cadence that instantly made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He operated out of a beautifully restored Victorian house in the Heights, surrounded by manicured gardens and water features designed to induce a state of immediate tranquility. It was the kind of environment where wealth was disguised as peace. Alicia had found him through her mother. Delphine had been complaining for months that Alicia looked tired, that her interior design business was draining her, and that I was useless in helping her navigate the stress. Delphine claimed she had met Dr. Combs at a charity gala for the Houston Grand Opera, and that he had worked wonders for several prominent families in River Oaks. At first, I was relieved when Alicia said she wanted to go to therapy. I knew I had been distant. The weight of my mother's stroke, the secret payments to the care facility, and the constant fear of our mortgage going into default had left me emotionally exhausted. I was physically present in our house in Pearland, but my mind was always running calculations, trying to find a way to stretch my city salary to cover 2 households. I thought a therapist would help Alicia manage her own anxiety about her business and give her a safe space to vent. "He wants to do individual sessions with me first," Alicia had told me one evening, her eyes filled with a desperate kind of hope. "Dr. Combs says we need to establish our individual emotional baselines before we can work on the partnership." "If you think it will help, sweetheart, do it," I had said, kissing her forehead. "Whatever you need." That was my first mistake. In my line of work, if you want to repair a damaged bridge, you don't look at the steel beams in isolation. You look at how the entire structure interacts with the soil and the traffic loads. But I trusted the credentials. I trusted the calm voice. For the first 4 months, Alicia went to see Dr. Combs twice a week. I began to notice a shift in her vocabulary. She stopped talking about her design clients or her projects. Instead, she started using clinical terms to describe our everyday interactions. If I came home exhausted after a 12-hour shift inspecting drainage ditches in the heat and sat quietly on the porch, she didn't ask how my day was. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, and said, "You're withdrawing again, Marcellus. Your silence is a form of emotional punishment." "I'm just tired, Alicia," I would say, rubbing my temples. "I've been on my feet since 5 this morning." "Dr. Combs says that fatigue is a common defense mechanism," she replied, her voice eerily calm, as if she were reading from a textbook. "You use your workload to avoid emotional intimacy with me and Nova. It's a passive-aggressive way of maintaining control over this household." I looked at her, completely baffled. The silence that she had once called her anchor was now being dismantled and reconstructed as a weapon. I tried to explain, tried to tell her about the sheer exhaustion of holding everything together, but every explanation was met with the same clinical shield. Then came the joint sessions. Dr. Combs invited me to join them for what he called a systemic alignment. I remember walking into his office. The air smelled of expensive lavender and cedarwood. Soft cello music played from invisible speakers. Xavier Combs sat in a leather armchair, a leather-bound notebook balanced on his knee. He didn't shake my hand. He simply gave me a warm, pitying nod. "Welcome, Marcellus," he said. "Alicia has been doing some very brave work here. I'm glad you've decided to step into the space with us." Within 10 minutes of the session starting, I realized I hadn't been invited to participate in a healing process. I had been summoned to a trial where the verdict had already been written. Every time I spoke, Dr. Combs would wait for me to finish, turn to Alicia, and say, "How does it feel when Marcellus uses that tone to dismiss your reality?" "I'm not dismissing her," I said, my voice tight. "I'm just explaining the logistics of our finances. We can't afford to remodel the kitchen right now. We have other obligations." "You see," Dr. Combs said, leaning forward and looking at me with a soft, clinical smile. "Marcellus, you immediately pivot to logistics and external pressures when Alicia expresses a desire for growth. This is what we call emotional gaslighting. By framing your refusal as a logical necessity, you invalidate her emotional experience. You make her feel like her desires are unreasonable, which is a subtle form of psychological containment." "It's not gaslighting, Dr. Combs," I said, trying to keep my temper in check. "It's a budget. Do you know how much a kitchen remodel costs? We are already stretched to the limit." "Marcellus," Combs said, his voice dropping an octave, filled with artificial empathy. "I hear your anxiety, but your obsession with financial scarcity is actually a manifestation of your need to control the environment. By keeping Alicia in a state of financial uncertainty and emotional deprivation, you ensure that she remains dependent on your stability. It's a very common pattern in men who suffer from underlying, unaddressed volatile personality traits." I looked at Alicia. She was nodding, her eyes wide, hanging on every word this man said. She looked at me not with love or even anger, but with a profound, terrifying pity. She genuinely believed him. She believed that her quiet, hard-working husband was actually a master manipulator who was keeping her emotionally hostage. In the realm of family therapy, there is a dangerous phenomenon known as concept creep. It is when clinical terms meant to describe severe pathology, like abuse, gaslighting, and narcissism, are slowly stretched to cover normal, everyday human struggles like fatigue, disagreement, and grief. When a therapist intentionally accelerates this concept creep, they aren't helping. They are rewriting the history of a marriage, converting a couple's shared memories into a narrative of survival and victimization. And Xavier Combs was a master of this craft. What I didn't know at the time was the financial engine driving this entire diagnosis. Dr. Combs' standard fee was $500 an hour. For the twice-weekly individual sessions and the weekly joint sessions, the monthly bill was close to $5,000. There was no way our joint account could have sustained that without me noticing. But I didn't see the bills. When I asked Alicia about the cost, she told me that Dr. Combs worked on a sliding scale for creative professionals, and that she was paying a nominal fee of $50 a session from her business account. It was a lie. The remaining $4,500 a month was being quietly transferred directly to Dr. Combs's private practice by Delphine Faulkner through a shell company called DF Consulting, LLC. Delphine wasn't just paying for therapy. She was purchasing a legal weapon. She knew that in a standard divorce, a mother with a stable job and no history of misconduct would easily share custody with a father who had a spotless record as a city official. But Delphine didn't want joint custody. She wanted Nova. She wanted her granddaughter raised in the Faulkner social circle, attended to by Faulkner-approved nannies, and groomed for the same political and social prominence that she had spent her life chasing. And to get that, she needed me completely out of the picture. She needed me declared legally and psychologically unfit. And Dr. Combs was more than happy to draft the blueprint for my destruction. The transition from a home to a cold, clinical observation deck happened so quietly, you don't even notice the locks being changed. By the winter of 2025, our 3-bedroom house in Pearland, Texas, had ceased to be a sanctuary. It had become a testing ground where every movement I made was logged, analyzed, and categorized under Dr. Xavier Combs's diagnostic framework. If I washed the dishes in silence, I was withholding connection. If I asked Alicia to clarify a charge on our joint credit card, I was exercising financial surveillance. I felt like an actor who had walked onto the wrong stage, handed a script written in a language I didn't speak, yet expected to perform flawless emotional gymnastics. I was exhausted. The pressure of keeping up the monthly payments for my mother's stroke rehabilitation facility in Houston was slowly crushing me. To pay the $2,800 monthly without draining our joint household account, I took on private freelance drafting consultations for independent developers in Harris County. I worked late into the night in our small study, the glow of my CAD software, the only light in the house. One evening in November, I was sitting at my desk, rubbing my eyes, when Alicia walked in. She didn't offer a cup of tea or ask how my mother was doing. She stood by the bookshelf, her posture stiff, holding herself as if she were protecting her personal space from a hazardous substance. "Marcellus," she said, her voice flat and devoid of any warmth. "Dr. Combs thinks it's time we discuss a formal trial separation. He believes your refusal to engage in vulnerable communication during our joint sessions is a sign that you are actively resisting the therapeutic process. He feels my emotional safety is compromised by your passive hostility." I stared at her, my hands hovering over the keyboard. "My passive hostility? Alicia, I am working 15 hours a day to keep this family afloat. I don't yell at you. I don't argue. I am trying to keep our foundation solid." "There it is again," she said, shaking her head with a look of profound, clinical pity. "The preoccupation with logistics, the financial martyrdom. You use your work as a shield to avoid the real work of this marriage. Dr. Combs warned me that when a personality type like yours is confronted, you will always retreat into the role of the silent provider to make the other partner look demanding." "I am not playing a role," I said, my voice rising slightly before I caught myself and forced it back down. "I am actually providing. There is a difference." "Please don't raise your voice at me, Marcellus," she said quietly, taking a step back. "It feels very volatile." She turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. I sat there in the silence, my heart hammering. I felt a terrifying sense of helplessness. No matter what I did, the script had already been written. If I stayed silent, I was withholding. If I spoke up, I was volatile. The breakthrough didn't come from a sudden confrontation. It came from a stack of misfiled tax documents. As a senior urban planner, I was meticulous with paperwork. Every December, I gathered our family financial records, our mortgage statements, and Alicia's interior design business expenses to prepare our joint tax filing. Alicia hated taxes, finding the endless spreadsheets overwhelming, so she had always gladly handed her business receipts and bank statements over to me. On a rainy Saturday morning, while Alicia had taken Nova to her ballet lesson, I sat down in the study to organize Alicia's business account statements. She kept her business files in a green filing cabinet in the corner of the room. As I pulled out the folder labeled Faulkner Design, Invoices 2025, my hand brushed against a thick, unlabeled manila folder that had fallen behind the drawer. I reached down, pulled it out, and opened it, expecting to find old design drafts or fabric samples. Instead, I found a series of monthly invoices from Combs Therapy and Associates. I frowned, looking at the first invoice dated March 2025. The total amount billed was $5,000. The client name on the invoice was Alicia Faulkner Renwick. But at the bottom of the page, under the payment method, it didn't list Alicia's business visa. It listed a wire transfer from an entity called DF Consulting, LLC. My chest tightened. I knew that name. DF Consulting, LLC was a private consulting firm that my mother-in-law, Delphine Faulkner, had established after she retired from the Houston City Council. I turned the page. April 2025, $5,000. Paid by DF Consulting, LLC. May 2025, $5,000. Paid by DF Consulting, LLC. June, July, August, September, October. Every single month, a wire transfer of $5,000 had been sent from Delphine's company directly to Dr. Xavier Combs's private practice. In total, over the course of 9 months, Delphine Faulkner had paid Dr. Combs $45,000. But it was what was stapled to the back of the August invoice that made the blood run cold in my veins. It was a printed email chain between Delphine's private email address and Dr. Combs's personal assistant. The subject line read, Progress Report and Strategy Alignment, Renwick Case. I leaned forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I read the words on the paper. Dear Councilwoman Faulkner, the email from Dr. Combs's assistant began. Dr. Combs has completed his initial assessment of Alicia. As we discussed, she is highly receptive to the therapeutic narrative. We have successfully recharacterized her husband's passive-aggressive silence as a form of deep-seated psychological withholding. Alicia is beginning to understand that her marital dissatisfaction is not a personal failure, but the result of her husband's underlying emotional instability. The email went on, outlining the next steps of the treatment plan. In the upcoming joint sessions, Dr. Combs will focus on eliciting defensive reactions from Marcellus. Any defensive behavior will be documented to support the narrative of behavioral volatility. Dr. Combs is confident that by the time of the legal filing, we will have a comprehensive clinical paper trail that demonstrates the husband's unfitness for unsupervised joint custody. The next invoice for $5,000 is attached. We appreciate your continued partnership in ensuring Alicia and Nova's long-term safety. My hands shook so violently, the papers rattled. It wasn't therapy. It was a contract. It was a slow-motion, professionally executed character assassination, funded by my mother-in-law and designed by a licensed psychologist. They weren't trying to save my marriage. They were building a legal cage, and they were using my wife's vulnerability and my own quiet, exhausted silence to lock me inside it forever. I stood up, the papers clutching in my fist. My first instinct was to scream, to confront Alicia the moment she walked through the door. But then I remembered the words in the email. Dr. Combs will focus on eliciting defensive reactions to support the narrative of behavioral volatility. If I reacted now, if I lost my temper and threw these papers in her face, I would walk straight into their trap. I would provide the exact, volatile reaction Dr. Combs needed. I stood in the center of my quiet study, looking at the photos of Nova on the wall. I couldn't afford to be angry. I had to be an urban planner. I had to look at the structural weak points of their design and dismantle it, brick by brick, without making a single sound. I walked over to the scanner, placed the invoices and the emails on the glass, and made 3 separate digital copies, saving them to an encrypted cloud drive. Then I carefully placed the original documents back into the manila folder, slid it back behind the drawer of the green filing cabinet exactly where I had found it, and sat back down at my desk. When Alicia and Nova came home an hour later, laughing about a dog they had seen at the bakery, I stood up and greeted them with a calm, gentle smile. "Did you have fun at ballet, sweetheart?" I asked Nova, pulling her into a hug. "Yes, Daddy. I did a perfect pirouette," she chirped. I looked over her head at Alicia. She gave me a tight, brief nod, her eyes reflecting that deep, therapy-induced pity that had become her default expression. She had no idea that her mother had bought her therapist, or that the husband she believed was unstable was currently calculating the exact coordinate of her undoing. The rain was coming down in sheets over downtown Houston when I pulled my Ford F-150 into the parking lot of a small diner off Westheimer Road. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 days after I had found the hidden manila folder in Alicia's filing cabinet. My chest still felt like it was wrapped in steel bands. Every time I looked at my wife or spoke to my daughter, I had to force my breathing to remain slow, even, and deliberate. I was playing a part now, just as Xavier Combs's assistant had outlined in those damning emails. I was the silent, predictable husband, waiting for the trap to spring. But I wasn't just waiting. I was planning. I walked into the diner, the smell of burnt coffee and greasy hash browns wrapping around me. The place was mostly empty, populated only by a couple of tired-looking city workers and a trucker staring at his phone. I scanned the room and saw her. Desiree Holt was sitting in a booth near the back, a ceramic mug of black coffee between her hands. She was dressed in a simple olive-colored sweater and jeans, looking far less formal than she had in the sterile corridors of the Harris County Family Court. "Thanks for meeting me," I said, sliding into the vinyl booth opposite her. "I shouldn't be doing this, Marcellus," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "As a mediator, if anyone in the county administration finds out I'm advising a litigant, I could lose my certification by tomorrow. But when you texted me saying you found something in writing, I couldn't ignore it." I didn't say a word. I reached into my leather briefcase, pulled out a manila envelope, and slid it across the table. Inside was a printed copy of the invoices from Combs Therapy and Associates, and the printed email chain between Delphine's consulting firm and Combs's office. Desiree pulled the documents from the envelope as she read through the monthly wire transfers from DFA. Consulting LLC, her eyebrows rose. But when she reached the August email chain, the one explicitly detailing the strategy to recharacterize my quietness and elicit defensive reactions, the color drained from her face. She read it once, then read it again, her thumb tracing the printed subject line: Progress Report and Strategy Alignment, Renwick Case. "My God," she whispered, looking up at me. "I knew he was a mercenary, but this is a blueprint for clinical fraud. He's not just evaluating your wife, Marcellus. He's actively scripting her testimony and fabricating your pathology on behalf of a third party who isn't even a parent in this case." "It's my mother-in-law, Delphine," I said, my voice tight. "She's been paying him $5,000 a month. Alicia thinks she's paying $50 a session. She has no idea her mother is funding a $45,000 smear campaign against me." "And she probably never would have found out," Desiree said, tapping the papers. "This is how Combs operates. He keeps the client, the wife, completely isolated in the therapeutic bubble. He makes her feel like she is the victim of a silent, abusive husband, while the mother-in-law pays the bills from a shell company. By the time it gets to court, the wife is so thoroughly brainwashed by the clinical terminology that she believes every lie she's telling on the stand. She's testifying to her therapeutic truth." "So how do we stop him?" I asked, leaning forward. "My attorney, Marcus, says that if we just present this email, Combs's lawyers will claim it's a violation of therapist-client privilege, or that it was obtained illegally because I found it in Alicia's business files. He says we need something more. We need to prove this is a systematic pattern." Desiree took a slow sip of her coffee. Marcus is right. In family court, therapists are treated like high priests. Judges don't like to question their methodologies unless you can show a clear, undeniable pattern of professional misconduct that transcends your specific case. We need to show that Xavier Combs does this as a business model. And how do we do that? By showing the court that you aren't the first father he's done this to, Desiree said. She opened her own briefcase and pulled out a small, yellow legal pad. I've been going through the public dockets for Harris County Family Court over the last 2 years. I searched for every custody dispute where Dr. Xavier Combs was introduced as an expert witness for the mother, and where the father had a spotless record, but was suddenly accused of withholding personality or emotional instability. She slid the legal pad toward me. On it were 3 names, written in neat, precise handwriting: Garrison Vance, David Chen, Robert Carter. These are the 3 men I told you about, Desiree said. Garrison is a high school principal. David is an aerospace engineer at NASA. Robert is an anesthesiologist. All 3 are quiet, analytical men. All 3 had immaculate professional records, and all 3 lost joint custody of their children because Dr. Combs wrote evaluations claiming their quiet natures were actually symptoms of covert narcissistic withdrawal and unpredictable volatility. The language in their evaluations is almost identical to yours. I looked at the names, feeling a strange mixture of relief and absolute horror. They use the exact same words? Almost word for word, Desiree nodded. Combs doesn't write custom evaluations, Marcellus. He has a template. He uses the same clinical jargon to pathologize normal, quiet men, because he knows that family court judges don't have the time or the clinical training to question a 40-page report filled with psychological terms. It sounds authoritative, so the judge signs off on it. Can we contact these men? I asked. I already have, Desiree said. They are angry, Marcellus. When I told them about your case and your financial evidence, they agreed to help. Garrison and David are willing to sign affidavits. They are even willing to testify if we can get an evidentiary hearing. I felt a sudden surge of hope. How do we get that hearing? We wait for the temporary custody hearing in 3 weeks, Desiree explained, her eyes flashing. Cynthia Sterling, Alicia's lawyer, is going to present Dr. Combs's preliminary evaluation as her main piece of evidence. That is our moment. Instead of arguing about whether you are a good father, your attorney will introduce our motion for an independent, court-appointed psychological evaluation. And as support, we will introduce the financial records from Delphine's LLC and the affidavits from the other 3 fathers. And that will force Combs to explain himself? It will force the judge to look at the financial connection between the therapist and the maternal grandmother, Desiree said, a cold smile appearing on her face. In Texas family law, an expert witness must be independent. If we prove that Combs was receiving $45,000 from an outside party with a vested interest in the outcome, his entire evaluation becomes legally toxic. The judge won't just throw it out. They will report him to the licensing board. I looked down at the paper, then back at Desiree. This is going to destroy my marriage completely, isn't it? Even if I win custody, Alicia will never forgive me for exposing her therapist and her mother in open court. Desiree's expression softened. Marcellus, your marriage was destroyed the moment your mother-in-law wrote that first $5,000 check, and your wife accepted a script instead of talking to her husband. Right now, you aren't fighting for your marriage. You are fighting for your daughter. You are fighting to make sure Nova knows who her father really is. I took a deep breath. She was right. In urban planning, when a foundation is structurally compromised beyond repair, you don't try to patch the cracks. You demolish the structure so you can build something safe on the clean ground underneath. Let's do it, I said. Call the other fathers. Tell Marcus to draft the motion. Desiree nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Get ready, Marcellus. Delphine and Combs are going to fight dirty, but they have no idea that the quiet man they've been pushing around has just found their blueprint. The double oak doors of courtroom 302 closed with a heavy thud, sealing out the chaotic hum of the Harris County Family Court. Inside, the atmosphere was sterile, smelling of lemon polish and old paper. Judge Evelyn Harper, a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s with a reputation for efficiency, sat behind the elevated wooden bench. "We are here on the matter of the marriage of Faulkner Renwick," Judge Harper announced, her voice echoing, "specifically to address the petitioner's motion for temporary custody orders and restricted visitation regarding the minor child, Nova Renwick." Cynthia Sterling, Alicia's attorney, stood up. "Your Honor, we are asking for an immediate restriction of Mr. Renwick's parental access. We have submitted a preliminary mental health evaluation conducted by Dr. Xavier Combs, one of Houston's most respected family therapists. The report outlines a pattern of profound emotional withholding, passive-aggressive control, and severe psychological volatility that makes Mr. Renwick a high risk for unsupervised custody." I sat perfectly still, my hands flat on the table. I looked at Alicia. She was staring at her hands, her face pale. Sitting right behind her in the front row of the gallery was Delphine, watching the proceedings like a general overlooking a battlefield. "We would like to call Dr. Xavier Combs to the stand to briefly summarize his findings, Your Honor," Sterling said. Judge Harper nodded. "Dr. Combs may take the stand." Xavier Combs rose from the gallery. He looked impeccably professional, wearing a dark gray wool suit, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the light. He walked to the witness stand with an easy grace, took the oath, and sat down. "Dr. Combs," Sterling began, "can you explain your clinical findings regarding Marcellus Renwick?" Combs leaned forward, his voice a low, soothing baritone. "Certainly. Over the last 9 months of evaluating Alicia, and through my limited observations of Marcellus, it became clear that Mr. Renwick displays severe traits of covert narcissistic withdrawal. He uses silence not as a passive state, but as an active, aggressive mechanism of control. When confronted with his wife's emotional needs, he retreats into a state of profound emotional withholding. This creates intense psychological anxiety for his daughter, Nova. In my professional opinion, his behavioral swings are highly unpredictable and represent a toxic developmental hazard." Sterling smiled. "Thank you, Dr. Combs. Your Honor, based on this clinical evidence, we believe the child's safety is at immediate risk." Judge Harper looked over her glasses at my attorney. "Mr. Vance, your witness." Marcus Vance stood up. He didn't look nervous. He carried a thin leather folder as he walked slowly toward the podium. "Thank you, Your Honor," Marcus said. He turned to Dr. Combs. "Dr. Combs, you are a licensed family therapist in the state of Texas. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Combs said smoothly. "And as an expert witness in family court, you are legally bound to provide an independent, unbiased, and objective evaluation of the family dynamics, correct?" "Of course. My duty is entirely to the psychological truth and the well-being of the child," Combs replied. "Excellent," Marcus said. He pulled out a stack of papers. "Then let's talk about the independence of your evaluation. Dr. Combs, what is your standard hourly rate?" "My rate is $500 per hour," Combs said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And how much have you been paid in total for your services in relation to the Faulkner Renwick family over the last 9 months?" "I believe the total is around $45,000, Combs said, shouldering. "Evaluating complex family systems is a time-consuming process." $45,000, Marcus repeated, turning to face the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce Exhibit A. These are the monthly bank transfer logs and invoices from Combs Therapy and Associates." Sterling jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. These are private financial records. Moreover, therapeutic billing is protected by client-therapist privilege." "The privilege belongs to the client, Mrs. Sterling," Marcus countered sharply. And in this case, the client didn't pay. Your Honor, if you look at the bottom of these invoices, the $45,000 was not paid by my client, Marcellus Renwick, nor was it paid by his wife, Alicia. Every single dollar was wire transferred directly to Dr. Combs's private practice by an entity called DF Consulting LLC, a private firm solely owned and operated by Delphine Faulkner, the maternal grandmother. The courtroom went dead silent. Alicia's head snapped up. She looked at the papers Marcus was holding, then slowly turned her head to look at her mother. Delphine's face had gone rigid, her jaw clenched, her gaze suddenly fixed on the wall. Your Honor, Marcus continued, Texas family law is very clear. An expert witness cannot be financially subsidized by a third party with a personal, non-parental interest in the custody outcome. This is a direct conflict of interest. But it gets worse. I would like to introduce Exhibit B. Marcus walked over to the evidence projector and placed a printed page onto the glass. The August email chain between Delphine's personal email address and Dr. Combs's personal assistant appeared on the monitors. This is an email from Dr. Combs's assistant to Delphine Faulkner, Marcus read. It states, as we discussed, she is highly receptive to the therapeutic narrative. We have successfully recharacterized her husband's passive-aggressive silence as a form of deep-seated psychological withholding. Dr. Combs is confident that by the time of the legal filing, we will have a comprehensive clinical paper trail that demonstrates the husband's unfitness. This is an outrage, Combs stammered, his smooth composure instantly shattering. That email it's a private administrative communication. It has been taken completely out of context. Is that so? Marcus said. Then let's look at the context of your other cases. Your Honor, I would like to introduce Exhibit C. This is a comparative analysis of 3 other custody evaluations written by Dr. Xavier Combs over the last 18 months. The cases of Garrison Vance, David Chen, and Robert Carter. Marcus placed 3 more documents on the projector. If the court compares these documents, you will see that the diagnostic descriptions are identical, Marcus said. In all 3 cases, the fathers are quiet, analytical professionals. In all 3 cases, Dr. Combs used the exact same phrases: covert narcissistic withdrawal, severe psychological volatility, and toxic developmental hazard. He didn't evaluate these families, Your Honor. He ran them through a template paid for by wealthy relatives who wanted to purchase a clinical script to strip good fathers of their parental rights. Combs's face went from pale to a dark red. He looked at Sterling, silently begging for an objection, but Sterling was sitting frozen. She knew the legal ground had just collapsed. Your Honor, Marcus said, we have subpoenaed Desiree Holt, a certified court-appointed family mediator in this county, who has documented this systematic pattern of fraudulent evaluations by Dr. Combs in 3 previous filings. She is waiting in the hallway to testify. Judge Harper looked down at Dr. Combs, her eyes cold as ice. Dr. Combs, Judge Harper said, her voice dripping with quiet fury. You have exactly 5 seconds to explain to this court why I shouldn't immediately strike your evaluation from the record. Refer your credentials to the Texas State Board of Examiners of Psychologists, and hold you in contempt of court. Combs opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I looked across the aisle at Alicia. She was trembling. She stared at the projector screen, reading the email where her mother had bought the clinical lies that had torn our family apart. A single tear ran down her cheek. She looked at her mother, who was avoiding her gaze, and then she buried her face in her hands and began to sob. By the time the bailiff cleared courtroom 302, the sky outside had turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the Houston humidity had dissolved into a cold, persistent drizzle. The court session had ended in a disaster for the other side. Judge Harper had officially struck Dr. Xavier Combs' preliminary mental health evaluation from the record, issued a formal warning to Cynthia Sterling regarding the source of her client's litigation funding, and ordered an expedited, independent, court-appointed psychological evaluation. More than that, she had stated on the record that a copy of the hearing's transcript would be forwarded to the Texas State Board of Examiners of Psychologists. It was a complete legal victory. But as I walked into the subterranean parking garage beneath the court building, I felt no triumph. I just felt a profound, exhausting emptiness. My boots clicked against the damp concrete, the sound echoing in the massive, mostly empty structure. I reached my truck, unlocked the door, and was about to climb in when I heard footsteps behind me. "Marcellus, please wait." Alicia was running toward me. She had left her lawyer behind. She wasn't carrying her designer handbag or her legal files. Her coat was half unbuttoned. Her hair was slightly damp from the drizzle, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. She looked smaller than she had in years, stripped of the clinical armor Dr. Combs had built around her. "What do you want, Alicia?" I asked, my voice flat. I didn't want to argue. I didn't have the energy. She stopped about 3 feet away from me, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "How could you let your lawyer humiliate me like that in front of everyone? In front of the judge?" I stared at her. "Humiliate you? Alicia, you brought a mercenary therapist into a court of law to declare me psychologically unfit so you could take my daughter away from me. You tried to legally brand me as an unstable danger to my own child, and you're asking me how I could defend myself?" "I didn't know," she cried, the tears spilling over her lower lids. "I swear to God, Marcellus, I didn't know about the money. I didn't know my mother was paying him $50,000. I didn't know they were emailing each other. I genuinely believed he was helping us. I believed him when he said you were withdrawing from me." "You believed him because it was easier than talking to me," I said, my voice steady but cold. "You let a stranger rewrite the last 10 years of our life. You let him convince you that my quietness was some kind of sick, covert abuse. We built a life together, Alicia, and you handed the keys to a predator because he used clinical words that made you feel like a victim." "Because you weren't there," she screamed, her voice echoing off the concrete pillars. "You weren't there, Marcellus. For the last year, you've been like a ghost in our house. You would come home, sit on the couch, and stare at the wall. You wouldn't look at me. You wouldn't talk to me. When I tried to tell you about my day, about the stress of my business, you just nodded and gave me these short, mechanical answers. Why did you just let me drift away? If you loved me, if you loved this family, why did you let me walk into that man's office alone?" The raw pain in her voice was real. The anger wasn't a script anymore. It was the desperate confusion of a woman who had realized her entire reality had been manufactured by others. I looked at her, and the anger I had been holding onto for 9 months suddenly evaporated, leaving only a deep, heavy sadness. "I was trying to keep us from drowning, Alicia," I said quietly. "What does that even mean?" she sobbed, wiping her face with her sleeve. "We weren't drowning. We had a beautiful house. Nova was happy. My business was struggling, but we were fine. You were the one who was drowning, Marcellus, and you wouldn't let me in. Do you know why my mother is in that specialized care facility in Houston?" I asked. Alicia blinked, momentarily thrown off by the change in subject. "Yes, because she had a stroke, and because her union insurance covers 90% of the cost. You told me that." "I lied," I said. The garage went completely silent. Alicia stared at me, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean you lied?" "My mother's union insurance didn't cover the facility," I said, each word feeling like a heavy stone I was finally letting drop. "They denied the claim 3 weeks after she was admitted. The cost of that facility is $2,800 a month. If we didn't pay it, they were going to transfer her to a state-run ward 80 miles away, a place where she would have been left in a bed with no physical therapy and no speech therapy. She would have died there, Alicia. She shook her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. But how did we pay for it? We didn't have that kind of money in our joint account. I watched the budget. No, we didn't, I said. Because I didn't use our joint account. I didn't want to stress you out. Your interior design firm was losing its biggest commercial contract, and you were having panic attacks in the bathroom every Tuesday. So I made a choice. I went to the city administration and I liquidated my personal pension fund, the retirement account I had been building since I was 28 years old. Alicia's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I cleared out the entire thing, I continued, my voice steady but thick with emotion. $52,000. I used it to pay the deposit and the first year of monthly fees. And when that ran out, I started taking on private consulting work. I was drawing drainage layouts and calculating water runoff capacities for independent developers until 2 a.m, every single night, in that little study. I did it so you wouldn't have to shut down your business. I did it so you wouldn't have to choose between your dream and my mother's life. Marcellus, she whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. You asked me why I was a ghost, I said, a tear finally slipping down my own cheek. I was a ghost because I was sleeping 3 hours a night. I was a ghost because my muscles ached, my eyes burned from staring at CAD software, and my brain was constantly running calculations to make sure our mortgage didn't default. I didn't tell you because I wanted to protect you. I wanted to be the anchor. I wanted to be the man who kept the foundation solid while the storm was hitting us. Alicia fell to her knees on the cold concrete of the parking garage, her shoulders shaking violently as she wept. The realization had finally landed with its full, devastating weight. The evidence of my emotional instability, the withholding personality that Dr. Combs had so carefully documented, and the volatile behavior she had testified to. It wasn't a psychological pathology. It was just the sheer, desperate physical exhaustion of a husband who was carrying the weight of 2 families on his shoulders in absolute silence, trying to keep them all from collapsing. I walked over to her, knelt down on the damp concrete, and gently placed my hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She leaned into me, burying her face in my chest, her tears soaking through my shirt. We stayed like that for a long time in the dim light of the empty garage, holding on to each other among the ruins of the life we had built, finally speaking to each other without a therapist's script. 6 months after that rain-soaked confrontation in the dark parking garage, the Texas State Board of Examiners of Psychologists formally suspended Dr. Xavier Combs' license to practice. The paper trail we had presented to Judge Harper was too massive, too systematic, and too toxic to ignore. Once the legal shield was cracked, the other 3 fathers, Garrison Vance, David Chen, and Robert Carter, stepped forward with their own affidavits, revealing a terrifying assembly line operation of clinical fraud. Combs hadn't been treating families. He had been manufacturing customized psychological weapons for wealthy, vindictive relatives who wanted to purchase the sole custody of their grandchildren. The Victorian house in the Heights, with its manicured gardens and soothing cello music, was closed down, its brass nameplate removed from the gate, leaving behind only a trail of fractured families who were now slowly trying to rebuild what he had systematically torn apart. Alicia and I did not magically fix our marriage overnight in that underground garage. The damage done by 9 months of professional brainwashing and deep-seated deception could not be undone by a single tearful confession on the concrete. But what we did do was stop the bleeding. The very next morning, Alicia instructed Cynthia Sterling to dismiss the divorce petition with prejudice. We agreed to a voluntary, temporary separation, not as a step toward divorce, but as a space to breathe, free from the toxic influence of attorneys, shell companies, and predatory therapists. I moved into a small apartment near downtown Houston, closer to my municipal office, while Alicia remained in the Pearland house with Nova. For the first 3 months, we didn't talk about custody, assets, or our future. We simply talked about Nova, and for the first time in years, we talked about ourselves without any clinical jargon. There were no discussions about covert withdrawal or emotional gaslighting. If I was tired, I told her I was tired. If she was anxious, she simply said she was scared. We had to strip away the clinical dictionary and learn the basic, messy vocabulary of two ordinary human beings who had lost their way. One Sunday afternoon in late spring, my mother-in-law, Delphine, came to my apartment. I was sitting on my small balcony, looking out over the Houston skyline, when the buzzer rang. When I opened the door and saw her standing there without her expensive wool coats or her political posture, she looked older, her signature gold brooch noticeably missing from her lapel. "Marcellus," she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp, administrative edge. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, letting her enter the small, sunlit living room. She didn't comment on the size of the apartment or the lack of expensive furniture. She stood by the window for a long moment, looking down at the street below. "I didn't come here to argue, and I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," Delphine said, her back still turned to me. "I came because Alicia told me about your pension fund. She told me about your mother." "I did what I had to do to keep my family standing, Delphine," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. She slowly turned to face me. For the first time in the 10 years I had known her, I saw a flicker of genuine regret in her eyes. "My husband, Alicia's father, was a quiet man, Marcellus, just like you. He was an accountant. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, and he never complained. When my political career started taking off, the hours were long, the stress was immense, and our house was always loud, always filled with people. He became quieter and quieter. He retreated into his office, staring at his spreadsheets while I ran the city. I thought his silence was a form of contempt. I thought he was punishing me for my success." She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "And then, one Tuesday morning, I came home from a council meeting and his closet was empty. He had packed his bags, left his keys on the kitchen island, and walked out. He didn't write a note. He didn't ask for a single dollar of our assets. He just disappeared. I spent 30 years believing that his silence was a weapon he used to hurt me. When Xavier Combs started talking about your quietness as a form of passive hostility and emotional containment, I believed him instantly. It was the exact narrative I had been telling myself about my own failed marriage for 3 decades. I let my own unresolved fears, my own bitterness, blind me to the reality of who you actually are. I thought I was protecting Alicia from the same silent abandonment I suffered, but instead, I almost destroyed her happiness. "I am not your ex-husband, Delphine," I said quietly. My silence wasn't contempt. It was exhaustion. "I know that now," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I am sorry, Marcellus. For what it's worth, I have stepped back entirely. I've closed DF Consulting, and I've told Alicia that whatever path she chooses with you, she must walk it without my money or my interference." After she left, I sat in the quiet apartment for a long time. It was a strange realization. The structural hazard in our marriage wasn't just Dr. Combs or Delphine's wealth. It was the unresolved trauma of the generation before us, projecting its own failures onto our quiet foundation. 2 months later, Alicia and I began marriage counseling, but this time, we didn't go to a Victorian mansion in the Heights, and we didn't let a wealthy relative pay the bills. We chose a licensed therapist together, a quiet, older woman named Dr. Eris, who operated out of a plain, brick medical center in Bel Air. We split the $300 hourly fee directly down the middle, 50-50, from our separate bank accounts. In those sessions, there were no scripts. We had to do the hard, uncomfortable work of rebuilding our infrastructure. I learned that my habit of hiding my financial struggles and physical exhaustion under the guise of protecting Alicia was actually a form of isolation. By carrying the mountain alone, I had locked her out of my life, leaving a vacant space that a predator like Xavier Combs was easily able to occupy. And Alicia learned that communication is not a performance. She learned that a partner's quietness is not a clinical diagnosis, and that sometimes a husband's silence is not an act of withholding, but a quiet, desperate plea for help. Yesterday, on a warm Saturday afternoon, we took Nova to the historic park in the 3rd Ward. The weather was beautiful, the typical Texas humidity replaced by a gentle, cool breeze from the Gulf. This was the park where Alicia and I had met 10 years ago, the one I had spent months redesigning to balance flood mitigation with community art spaces. As I sat on a wooden bench under a massive, century-old live oak tree, I watched Nova running across the grass, her laughter echoing through the air as she chased a yellow butterfly. The sunken retention basin, which I had designed to look like a brick amphitheater, was surrounded by wild Houston wildflowers, purple coneflowers, blue bonnets, and yellow coreopsis, all blooming in the warm sunlight. It was exactly as Alicia and I had envisioned it a decade ago, a structure built for safety, yet filled with beauty. Alicia sat down next to me on the bench, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to me, her hand brushing mine. She didn't say anything. She just leaned her head against my shoulder, her breathing matching mine in the quiet afternoon. We didn't need to fill the space with words. We didn't need a clinical framework to validate our connection. We were just 2 people, sitting together under the shade of a tree we had fought to save, resting on a foundation we had rebuilt with our own bare hands. If there is one thing my career in urban planning and my survival in family court have taught me, it is this: the silence of a man is not a blank canvas for you to paint your worst fears upon. It is not a symptom, it is not a pathology, and it is certainly not a weapon. Sometimes, a man's silence is simply the quiet, invisible strain of a foundation holding up the entire house while the storm rages outside. If you are blessed with a quiet partner, do not let the high-priced experts, the well-meaning relatives, or the clinical scripts of this world translate that silence for you. Talk to them. Listen to the quietness. Because if you let strangers write the script of your marriage for too long, you might wake up one day and realize you've completely forgotten who the person sitting next to you actually is. And by then, the foundation might already be gone. Take a moment tonight. Turn off the phones. Step away from the endless noise of diagnostic trends and social media advice, and just look at the person you love. Ask them how they are carrying the weight of their world. Because a quiet foundation